So chatting about frameworks for blockchain ethics. And I think that, this is kind of zooming back out to the macro level. And I think the hope for all of you is to be able to, as you think about the future of this, of what blockchain ethics could look like, these are ways to kind of bucket it in your mind. And so, as a reminder, and what we're all kind of saying here, that this technology is very difficult to understand. We're still at the very beginning stages, and there's this elephant analogy where depending on where you're touching it, whether you're from the permission blockchain side or you're a Bitcoiner or you're a Ethereum person, it looks very different to very different people. And so it's very complicated to understand. It's especially complicated to understand the full impacts of these technologies. So you can imagine what we're doing today is just looking at a bunch of different lenses, trying to put on different lenses to understand this technology. And so those three lenses I like to think of as tech ethics, where you think about the actual tech of the digital technology, financial ethics, where you think about the kind of money piece, the value piece, and then institutional ethics, which is where you think about this thing as a new kind of institution, a new kind of thing that can coordinate and motivate humans. So if we think about it as tech ethics first, remember that what tech ethics is not, and this is tough for people who first get in it, but it's not just philosophizing about abstract notions of what to do. You're not getting all Aristotle or Plato up in here. Instead, what you're doing is more kind of systems analysis, where you say, okay, let's understand this complex system, and you think about the technology, and you think about the economics piece, you think about the culture, the norms that Patrick was talking about, you think about the policy, and then you say, okay, based off of those things, if you propagate those through time, what are the impacts? Are they positive? Are they negative? And then once you see some of the positive or some of the negative, then you say, ooh, how can we make the positive happen more, and how can we make the negative happen less? And then so you try to intervene in that complex system. So that's kind of what people often mean by tech ethics. And what you usually do, there's a whole bunch of other things that are part of this, but what you usually do with tech ethics is you look at the technological affordances, which is where you look at what the technology can do, and you say, what are the impacts of those affordances? And so this has happened through time, whether you're looking at agricultural revolution, you're oh, now we have these farms, how does that impact society? You're we have the steam engine, how does that impact society? Or you have these computers and the internet, how does that impact society? And so for blockchain specifically, what are blockchain's affordances? I like to think of kind of three big ones here. There's one piece, which is the immutable distributed database. So you have on the far right side, that's you used to have a centralized ledger, and now you have this distributed ledger where everybody has a copy of the database. And it's immutable in the sense that it is tamper resistant or tamper proof. It is hard to go and change things back in time. That's one kind of technological affordance of blockchain. Another piece is the cryptography piece, and that provides you both consent, and that's with public and private key cryptography. So that's the ability to, for me, even if a nation state wants to take my Bitcoin, it is very, very difficult for them to do so unless they get my private key. And it has this pseudonymity piece, which is the idea that when all these transactions happen on the blockchain, they look like this jumbled series of letters and numbers, and you can't really tell who it is, though if you do a bunch of analyses and things like that, you can probably map that onto real-world identities. So that's the second piece. And this third piece is protocols and decentralization for unstoppable code. And what I mean by that is, you can think of these protocols. The internet has been built with these protocols that you can see down here, and those are generally protocols for information, for passing information around the internet. Now we have this new protocol, whether it's Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then these new layered protocols that are these protocols for value. And so instead of just passing info, we can pass value. And when you start to pass value around, especially from a protocol perspective, protocols are things that are trustless and permissionless. And what you get, just like with the early internet, you get this let 1,000 flowers bloom thing, where a bunch of people can try a bunch of different things, and you get this decentralization piece, where this is a graph of a map of all the nodes that are running Bitcoin software around the world. And why can they do that? Well, it's just because you run the software, everybody has this protocol that says how they all connect. And that allows people to connect into this new Bitcoin network. And what that then allows, the protocol piece and the decentralization piece, is it allows for this thing that you could call unstoppable code or censorship-resistant money. And that idea is the idea that when the government or when someone says, you are breaking a law, you are doing something unjust, then when they try to say, like, shut down the Bitcoin network, it is difficult to say, do you do that to the miners or the nodes or the users or whoever? So that's kind of this third piece, is this thinking of this technology as protocols and decentralization. So once we have these affordances, I think these are the big buckets of affordances, you then map them into the positive. You can look at this is like a brainstorm of some positive and negative impacts. And almost always, the thing I want to get across to everybody here is that almost always these positive and negative impacts are the vice versa of each other. So it's a system between them where you're doing some kind of trade-off situation. So this affordance, if you look at immutable distributed database, you're like, okay, a positive thing is it's this great source of truth, a single source of truth. But of course, the negative piece is like, people are like, the right to be forgotten, GDPR, like how does that work with blockchain? Another example is like the cryptography for pseudonymity. It's great because you can have like some privacy from surveillance to some extent. But as we know, pseudonymous is not anonymous. So you can there are a bunch of these like linking attacks and things that allow people like Chainalysis and whatever to look at transactions and determine real world identities from those transactions. On the permissionless protocol side, as I said before, and it's the same with the internet, we had these new protocol. It let 1,000 flowers bloom. Same with blockchain and crypto. You let 1,000 flowers bloom. It's really exciting. A lot of experimentation can happen. Lots of ICOs get to try things. Lots of Bitcoin forks. All the above. Anybody can add, send a pull request to Bitcoin software. But on the negative side, this one is moderately confusing. But this decreased friction, when initially you think it's just going to let 1,000 flowers bloom, what it actually does is gives you massive aggregators like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and the long, long tail of those 1,000 flowers. So this re-centralization piece, if anybody watched was here yesterday for the mining piece, that was all about this decreased friction leads to re-centralization, which is the mining in Bitcoin being that being a permissionless decreased friction network that leads to re-centralization. One final piece here is if you think about the decentralization piece, as I noted before, positive side is that, it allows people to disobey unjust laws. If you're somewhere and you're like, great, I want to do something and the government can't punish me, I can maybe do that and send somebody money through, like if I wanted to send WikiLeaks money in 2012 and I thought that was an okay thing to do, I could do that because of this decentralization. But of course, the negative side is who then should we hold accountable? So all those are pros and cons that are based off of the same affordances. And that is how you view blockchain ethics as tech ethics. You can also view blockchain ethics as financial ethics, or money ethics, or whatever you want to call it. And again, this has had a history over time of there have been different kinds of money over time and get different kinds of institutions that are connected to that money. And as I referenced earlier, right now we're kind of in a small phase here with cryptocurrency where it's only about a $200 billion market cap compared to something like gold, which is about 40x at about 8 trillion. Stocks are 70 trillion, money is 70 trillion, and derivatives are 700 trillion, which is a lot. And so we're still in the small stages, but you can still kind of apply similar mindsets that you might apply to these other things to blockchain and crypto. And so I think there are two big ways to think about these financial ethics. The first is just at a general level about how money and incentives change society. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then the other piece is this public policy goals. So these are, if anybody was in here yesterday with Gary Gensler's talk, he knows a lot about these public policy goals that exist. And you can kind of map those into crypto as well. So the impact of money and incentives, again, it's a positive, negative thing where on the negative side, once you have money out there, people will do anything for money. And this is, you see Ponzi schemes, you see scams, you see all kinds of aggressive things because this is value technology, as Quinn was saying. And at the other side, greed can be good. There's been a lot more push towards innovation and research in this space as a result. On another negative here is that it ignores externalities. So just having money and the incentive to do something, it's usually contextualized within a system, But if you think about Bitcoin mining and climate change, Bitcoin uses about 1/500th of the world's electricity. That's just an ignored externality, essentially, of the Bitcoin system. And on the positive side, it's an optimized system. Like, people are just doing what they're doing, securing the network. As we also chat about here, I think to some extent about the Western mindset towards money and value, and how we have this, especially with just pure one-dimensional money, it doesn't understand other kinds of value like social relations and things. And then this final piece here of these, money is very good. Money essentially has these reinforcing feedback loops that consolidate power. If you have money, you can get more money. Money does not have baked into it a natural evaporation demurrage system that pushes the money out as you get more of it. Instead, you get stuff like Gini coefficients in Bitcoin and Ethereum, et cetera, that are very, very high because if you're Peter, yeah. So those are some of the negatives and positives of money and incentives generally. If you think about the public policy goals, these are all about managing risks and information asymmetries. There are three big policy goals that people can think about. First is guarding against illicit activities. These folks usually think of cryptocurrencies as money, and the regulatory body here, and what they're trying to do is they're saying, hey, people shouldn't be able to pay other people around the world for child pornography or drugs or what have you. And the regulatory body that does this is generally FinCEN or the FATF. That's the International Financial Actions Task Force, and they think a lot about things like KYC and AML, where you into the on-ramps of crypto, you need to know your customer to KYC them to make sure that you know who they are, so that if they do end up paying for drugs, you can get them for it. So that's one big policy goal. The second big policy goal is investor and consumer protection. And so this is the idea. This is very connected to all of the securities stuff that came out recently, and making sure that if you can, if you're offering people to make money for them, that you can't just sell them snake oil and things of that variety. And so these people usually think of cryptocurrency as a security or a commodity or a derivative. And so the regulatory bodies here are the SEC, which does security stuff, and this is all United States specific, unfortunately. That's what I know. And the CFTC, which does commodities and futures kind of derivative stuff. And so these people think a lot about things like accredited investor laws to say, hey, how do we determine who can gain access to, and who do we trust enough to invest in some of these cryptocurrencies or securities. There's the final policy goal here, which is macro systemic stability. And so this is the piece that we were talking about 2 seconds ago about if Bitcoin, because it's still very, very small compared to the rest of all those other asset classes, if there was a huge issue with it, it would not be too big of a deal, all things considered. But long term, we need to think about the macro systemic stability. When you do so you're trying to, this takes as essentially the 2008 financial crisis is what you're trying to stop here. And these people think of cryptocurrency as money, and the regulatory bodies here are folks like the Fed or central banks that see things primarily like Libra and other central bank digital currencies and corporate cryptocurrencies, and they say, ooh, how will these things affect society from a macro systemic perspective? How will they affect nation states' ability to do monetary policy, things like that? So those are, within financial ethics, the kind of traditional public policy goals that map into cryptocurrency and blockchain tech. The final piece here, the final lens to view it through, is what I call institutional ethics. And institutional ethics really is, that's a made-up term. It's new institutional economics is the correct, what people usually think about here. And this is the idea of, this was kickstarted with Ronald Coase in 1937 with the theory of the firm. And the idea, the question that he had was, hey, if markets are so good at allocating resources, why do firms exist? He was thinking about these two different things in society, markets and firms. Why is it not all markets? Why is it not all firms? Why do we have both? And the conclusion he came to was markets are really good at incentive maximization. They're really good at paying people money to do what they want, but they're not necessarily good at transaction cost efficiency. So a market For example, in something like a firm, I can just tell an employee to do something, versus in a market, I need to like offer a price for it, and then maybe hopefully people will do it. And so the market is kind of looked at against something like the firm, which has less good incentive maximization, but which has better transaction cost efficiency, where you're able to more easily kind of organize and delegate things there. So this idea of new institutional economics is one that got economists and others thinking about the kind of coordinating and motivating functions of society, these kind of units that we all live in. And there are others as well, not just markets and firms, but other things like religions you can kind of think of as institutions that coordinate and motivate people. You can think of nation states as institutions, all of the companies over there, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, these new internet aggregators, you can think of them as a new kind of institution. And then now we have these new kinds of blockchain and cryptocurrency networks that, again, coordinate and motivate people. And so you can think of them as from an institutional perspective. One other piece here is that as you think about these, primarily, as far as I understand, the way that you should think about this is all of these different kinds of institutions kind of competing with each other in a co-evolutionary sense. So you think from kind of a competitive evolutionary dynamics perspective and think of these different institutions and how they're competing for mind share and efficiency share around getting humans to take part in them. So from this perspective, there's a bunch of other different things that motivate and coordinate people. As I noted recently, we've seen new ones pop up, like these new networks or internet aggregators or platforms, and how those have kind of rose to prominence in the last 10 years in society. So when you're viewing things from this perspective, you think a lot about things like ledgers, because a lot of these things involve ledgers. You think about the transaction costs in these networks and how they are good or bad at various types of transaction costs. You think about the trust in these networks. With something like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, it's these new kinds of distributed trusts where the trust is kind of built into the network through you essentially outsource it to the miners to keep the ledger, to keep a consensus around the ledger. And so this new kind of distributed trust in these systems. You can think about how information and capital flow within these systems, within these institutions, and how they compete for it. And then possibly most importantly, you think about the stories behind these institutions. And so the stories behind blockchain and cryptocurrency technology often involve things like, crypto anarchism or things like that, where you're like, let's exit the nation state, let's create new kinds of institutions that are not too big to fail, that do not involve these big centralized players. And people will be like, ooh, that's exciting. I want to participate in that institution and not another one. So with that said, when you're thinking about this from an ethical perspective, primarily what you think about is, and this question was asked earlier, which is this evolution versus revolution question, and this idea called creative destruction externalities. And what those are is when you create some kind of new industry, what happens, so something like self-driving trucks and truck drivers is the one that's classically talked about today. We're like, ooh, we're going to have self-driving trucks. When we have that, if and when we have that, then what will happen to all the truck drivers and their jobs? How can we re-educate them? How can we get them part of society? Should we use universal basic income, etc.? That question has one that has happened throughout all of time, and we call them externalities because when you're building these new systems, you're not necessarily thinking about the old systems and how you're taking down these old systems of power or removing jobs from people. You're just thinking about building this new system. And so there's just two quick examples here of like, hey, this quote on the left of how long until GoFundMe is our nation's leading healthcare provider. There are a lot of funding, a lot of people fund their own healthcare through GoFundMe now. Not a lot of people, but $250 million went through it, I think, in 2017. And because it's this new kind of institution that allows people to get money through it. And is that good? Is that bad? Tough to say. We should at least think, we shouldn't just say, yeah, GoFundMe is what we should use for all of our nation's healthcare programs. We should think from more of an evolutionary perspective there. And similarly, this easy one here of when you had the internet and the new internet aggregators like Facebook, and then this very kind of not just broadcasting like media or like newspapers, but narrowcasting to give people personalized red feeds and blue feeds. once you have that, that changes how people see the society and the world. And when this happened, we didn't necessarily think, oh, we're going to have these new internet aggregators like Facebook. They will change how people view the world, and that will possibly drastically affect how we do politics and stuff in society. Instead, these things just got built from a revolutionary perspective. Let's make these great new things, and they'll take down old kinds of media, and we'll build this new kind of media. So when you're thinking from an institutional perspective, in general, try to be as evolutionary and less revolutionary as possible. So those are the three big kinds of mindsets to view this technology from as it gets built out. And with that, I think, thank you. So we're going to do maybe a couple minutes of questions for me, and then maybe a couple minutes of questions with the discussion with everybody else. So thank you. Yeah, so we have 7 minutes left, so let's do like 2 questions here, and then we're going to do a little bit of everybody discussion. Is there someone who hasn't raised their hand that wants to ask a question? If not, then you're allowed. Okay.
Yeah, cool. So, and of course, this is probably predictable, but I would ask you to actually just like open even the wiki article and read the engineering ethics definition, because I think it's well suited, certainly alongside the perspectives offered. But although engineering as a discipline is relatively young, it's been really drilled in with the concept of ethics, because you're building essentially public infrastructure, and the default is public good before duty to client, before the duty to making profit, which is like a de facto thing that shows up in civil and electrical, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I guess I just said it, but the point is that this is actually really important, because we are in fact talking about equipment that's infrastructural. People use it maybe without even realizing that they're using it, and there's a whole ethics there, and I think it's worth remarking on in this setting. We can talk about it more later if people are interested.
I think thank you. And it sounds like that's engineering in the engineering physical things, not engineering in like the ACM sense. Yeah, great.
Engineering like the discipline.
Yeah.
Which involves the design part and the implementation and the maintenance and the life cycle and the things you destroy when you put it up.
Yeah, that I would love to view that, and I think I will add it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Rhys. That was a really good overview. I'm interested. I have a very broad question for you. So, I mean, one of the problems with ethics, if we start talking about these things as ethics at all, we usually start defaulting to here's an ethics framework, or here's a kind of something that we all need to sign and agree with. And that is really insufficient for a start. So ethics as an idea doesn't really work with a lot of the things that you're talking about. And also, we can only, because with technologies, you don't really know what the outcome's going to be. You don't know how people are actually going to use them in the end. So to say that, I mean, and I'm torn on this, because I think one of the promises with blockchain is that you can start to move away from seeing this as some kind of charter that we all need to sign as nations or whatever, to, well, maybe we should actually just think about creating code which does good and not bad. But you don't really know how code's going to play out in the world. You can only really know these things by studying them and making decisions all the time in ways which are responsive, right? So anyway, that's the question. Do you actually think this is about ethics?
Yeah,
and frameworks?
Good question. So I think, no, well, I think it's about frameworks, but I'm a frameworks person, but I think it's mostly about this slide. I think what you're getting at is, I think, this slide versus this slide. And I think of it this is really a question that I have and that we all have is, when making this question, which is how should we positively shape the impact of this technology, what you should name that group of people who are doing that is tough to say. Unfortunately, or fortunately, but I think mostly unfortunately, that field is usually called tech ethics, and that we're coming from a thing like AI ethics, where that is a meme that exists in the world, and we should essentially use the same meme, which is why it's called blockchain ethics. In fact, it's a lot more similar to what you're talking about, I think, which is hey, these are kind of these weird complex systems with a lot of different pieces. We can start to analyze them, understand how they're going to impact society, and then try to intervene in these complex systems in a positive way. And this involves very, very little of this kind of deep kind of philosophical thing, and more just kind of like waking up and being a little bit reflective. That would be my piece. So what I want to do, so we essentially are out of time, and so what I want to do is be done with one thing that I would say the two final pieces as you all flow off into the rest of your lives here. First is I think that I think that a lot of, especially when we think about building this field, I think that Quinn's 8 suggestions there are crucial for all of this as we start to do research ethics and think about conflicts of interest and all of that. And so we'll definitely make sure to share all of that, and for all of you researchers to make sure you're trying to use that and do this kind of bottom-up lab-based research ethics approach. I think that's one thing that I would leave with everybody. And the second thing that I would leave with everybody, is we're going to send out a feedback form, both about the event, but more than about the event, it's about ideas that you all have in building this field. And so when you all do that, definitely feel free to add any suggestions or questions or things in there about what you want to do for blockchain ethics more generally. So with that, I want to just thank you, Patrick and Quinn, one more time, and thank you all again for coming to the event. Woo!